Hello, and welcome back to Bad Canadians. I'm your host, Jared Michael. Here at Bad Canadians, we attempt to understand Canada's contrarians. We believe contrarians are sometimes the only people holding valuable information the rest of society desperately needs. Okay, well, I really enjoyed my conversation I had with longtime Canadian cultural critic Lydia Perovic. She's the author of 3 books. Her latest book is published through Sutherland Books. It's called Lost in Canada, An Immigrant's Second Thoughts. I have it right here. It was a fantastic read. I invited Lydia on the show to talk about the ideas she discussed in there. It kind of chronicles her journey from growing up in Yugoslavia, Montenegro, and emigrating to Canada in 1999, kind of jumping enthusiastically into the Canadian project, becoming a cultural critic, writing a lot about opera, theater, classical music. But then in the last 5 years, she's kind of really been uncomfortable with a lot of the new ideas coming into Canadian culture that she feels is transforming it in a dangerous direction, we could say. We kind of spent the first bit of the conversation talking about her Yugoslavia and maybe the bit of the immigration process until we kind of settled into a conversation a bit more about those broader ideas. I really enjoyed it. Lydia is a gifted writer. You can find her current writings on the Long Play Substack, where she writes about Canadian culture, Canadian news, Canadian history, and kind of you're going to find information there that you just generally aren't finding in the legacy media these days. I just want to mention, if you are watching this on YouTube, my camera gets a little blurry in the beginning just for a few minutes, so don't panic. It clears up and is fine for the rest of the recording. Okay, hope you enjoy the conversation. Lydia Perovic. Well, Lydia, welcome to Bad Canadians. I really appreciate you being on the podcast. Thank you so much for being here. I look forward to talking with you.
Thank you so much. Love the name.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a bit of a touchy name with people. I think almost everybody in my life has told me at some point I should ditch the name. But it's one of those things where it's the name is what kind of came with the whole vision at the very beginning. And so it's just one of those gut instincts of trusting that initial kind of kernel that started the whole thing. So I've just kind of stubbornly stuck by the name, despite it kind of turning some people off because I think they don't quite understand it necessarily. But I think you kind of pick up the spirit of the name.
Absolutely. It's when you call people sick. You mean exactly the
Yeah.
opposite. Oh, dude, that's sick. It's meanings change. But I totally know what you mean. It's what is Canadian patriotism? It's not an easy answer. Like, is it
No.
a flashy thing that you wear, or is it something else? So, no, I think it's a fantastic name.
Oh, okay. I appreciate it. Yeah. Well, I have you on the podcast because I have your book right here, actually, still Lost in Canada, An
Thank
Immigrant's Second
you.
Thoughts. And so that came out in 2022. And for the listener, it kind of chronicles we're of the same generation. I think I'm a little older than you, but I could kind of resonate with that kind of Gen X kind of feeling. Despite you growing up in Yugoslavia, there was this kind of kindred spiritness I could feel throughout the book. But at the same time, the book chronicles your kind of growing up in Yugoslavia and then emigrating to Canada in 1999 and kind of jumping into the Canadian project and then kind of having these doubts the last 5 years or so. And I grew up in the 80s in a small town, Alberta, up north. And so as much as we had that similarities of Gen X, like you grew up in a very different environment. So I just wondered if we could just start with just talking a little bit about what it was like growing up in Montenegro during the Yugoslavian Civil War and what it takes to have an individual want to leave the country that they grew up in. And for full disclosure, I'm one of the people who, prior to reading your book, I would have been hard pressed to find Montenegro on a map. I had to really take a crash course in Yugoslavia, the Balkans, like the Civil War, all of that. I just had very, very little understanding. So I went online and kind of got caught up on the very, very surface basics of it. But it'd be nice to hear you speak about that a little bit.
We were in the news in the 90s as the country was falling apart. So there was a series of small wars happening, and then one big war in Bosnia, and then the big war involving NATO in Kosovo. So that was the final. So NATO intervention over what used to be known Serbia and Montenegro, the country fell apart. I mean, I don't want to bore you. Once you start with the Balkan history, you go back to Romans and Greeks. So I don't want to do that.
Well,
But
that's one of the differences I really felt right away was just how much history was on your shoulders compared to Canada, where we kind of have this very, it's proven to be complicated, but much simpler story. So yeah, just that weight of history on your shoulders.
yeah, yeah, shorter. I mean, your story is shorter, but yeah, it's double, triple, quadruple, and you go. And some of the like, medieval times still pop up in conversation in the Balkans. Of course there's the big chunk that was like several hundred years under the Ottoman Empire. So that's and then of course bits under Austria-Hungary. That was many hundreds of years, and then bits of the country were occupied or the territory of the Republic of Venice, and those Greeks. So it's constantly changing. But I don't want to go as far. I was just going to say the 80s were relatively peaceful. And then in the 90s, as pluralism was introduced, as the Berlin Wall fell, those were not good times for Yugoslavia. Whereas you had like Central European countries just abandoning, some murdering their dictators and abandoning communist regimes and introducing some kind of pluralism, having first big elections. In Yugoslavia, this came with nationalism. So everybody started hating their neighbor. How come you're Orthodox, you're Catholic, you're Muslim? Finally, people started noticing those differences.
Right.
And Slovenia took off, then Croatia took off, then it was a war. I mean, it's way too complicated. I don't have to dwell on that. So hundreds of thousands of people have left in the 90s. And then in the next decade, further hundreds of thousands. And the region is still outside Croatia and Slovenia, which are in the EU now. The region is still net losing people. So it's still difficult. Like Serbia now has a strongman government, stable, but it's completely under control of one man and one party.
Right.
And they won the election. They keep winning the election. So once you introduce the election, the problem is not solved.
Right. Right.
They influence all the media, right? So after a certain amount of time, you will have, if you're lucky, you get real pluralism and a lot of instability. Then you may end up with a strong. So it's so complicated. But how I ended up going is I got an M8 scholarship at Dalhousie. So you apply. You don't know what you're doing. You just look at the Peterson's Guide. It has all the U.S. and Canadian universities. There wasn't much of an internet there then. And you apply where you think people might be interested in what you do. And I was interested in political theory. And then I applied to 3 or 4 places. You have no idea what you're doing. I had no idea what I was doing. It was probably inept application packages. It was very bad. By some miracle, I got a scholarship for Dalhousie. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to leave at all.
Right.
And so I left. My parents were retired. It's just not much money. Like now, to move and do your MA, you really have to have a lot of money. I mean, Canadian immigration system was such that it always favors if you go there's a famous point system for permanent residents. I'm not sure if it still exists. A lot of governments have tweaked the system. But back then, you could become a permanent resident if you go through the point system. So each attribute would give you some points, and you get the total. And if you have the total, you're probably going to get in. So one of the point is you got to speak either French or English. You got to have some education. So if you have a graduate degree, that gives you more points. Blah blah blah. There's various different things. Youth is always more favored. So I was in
Right.
my 20s, so that got me some points. So and I think it used to ask also. It's not net worth. It's savings or something, so you can show that you can live on your own without a job, and then job offer gives you extra points. So, I mean, that kind of stuff, you'd have to come from a middle class family. I mean, this is why we have most of the immigrants to Canada come from big export countries like China and Indian
India.
subcontinent. Like, I think most immigrants that come to Canada are from China and Hong Kong, where now they're wealthy societies, China and Hong Kong. growing middle class, growing upper middle class, and upper class. And there's a lot of money in China and India. So it's easier to immigrate. And this is why you see so few, I think this is why you see so few East European immigrants. Because, I mean, those countries are still mid to low income countries.
Right.
You don't
Yeah.
have a mass middle class who wants to send kids to an anglophone university and pay all the costs. That just doesn't happen. So
Right.
this is, of course, one of the reasons why the race discourse is a bit more complicated. In that, in that, if you're middle and upper class East Asian or South Asian, you're likelier to have a successful immigration than if you come from countries like Montenegro or even Romania and countries that are now in the EU. Anyway, I wandered off, but yeah, bring us back to what you're interested in.
Oh, that's interesting. I was just before I bring us back, I'm just wondering where then, if people are still leaving the Balkans and not, let's say it's more difficult to come to places like Canada, where are they tending to go to these days then?
There's a lot of intra-European migration.
Yeah.
There's some percentage does happen to be in Asia. So that you would go to a very wealthy Chinese city and teach maths, for example,
Right.
or ESL if your English is really good. I know people who've lived in Shanghai for 3 or 4 years. There are spots like people go to Singapore, some people go to Dubai, and I don't expect this would be permanent immigration. This would
Right.
probably
Right.
be what was known during Cold War as Gastarbeiter. Germany had Gastarbeiter, guest workers. Lots of East Europeans would go to Germany. They would never, ever have a chance of a path towards citizenship.
Right.
It was
Right.
just in the laws. You're clear. You're never going to become a citizen. You just work here, make a lot of money, send a lot of money home,
Right.
and after 10 or 20 years, you go back. So I suspect that's how the Asian system works. I don't think there's a lot of what we'd call integration and assimilation. But maybe I'm talking out of school. I haven't looked at those immigration systems. And also, Britain was a big thing during the EU. So you would have a lot of people from Poland, a lot of people from Czech Republic, from Romania, from Albania. Also, they're not in the EU. And one of the reasons for Brexit is the hundreds of thousands of people who would fill up spots that the locals don't want to do anymore, like fruit picking and PSWs. And
Yeah.
it's similar here, right? You
Yeah.
rarely see a natural born Canadian on certain jobs
Yeah. Yeah.
anymore.
Okay, so you mentioned earlier just how that, eventually those differences that people were not seeing in Yugoslavia kind of became front and center, the nationalistic ethnic differences. And so you speak in your book about kind of coming to Canada and enthusiastically being able to say we, very easily for, the last 20 years. And, but in the last 5 years or so, you kind of speak to, is that same phenomenon you're kind of speaking? Is it a similar phenomenon that you see unfolding now in Canada? Is that
It was from the left in Canada, interestingly. Whereas in most other countries, so we're talking about universal citizenship, right? Where it doesn't matter what your ethnicity is, what your religion is, what your
would this be like
sex
an
is,
Enlightenment value, essentially, a universalism?
equality before the law.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
that's a huge, huge work. That's a huge amount of work. Like European countries went to centuries of monarchic absolutism and inter and ethnic and interreligious strife. It was like lots of people have died until I guess people understood that somebody who's not your religion can be equal citizen to you and of equal value. Like, it was a huge, huge process. And in Canada, that was sped up because we were a new country. It was less things go fast, and it was part of the British Empire. And I wonder if that kind of universal citizenship was one of the legacies of the British Empire. Because you look at the Anglo world now, all the other countries have that kind of a universal citizenship in the Anglo world. Of course, the U.S. as well,
Hmm.
Britain, Australia, New Zealand, right? So but that's a different question. But criticism of that kind of universal citizenship came from the left in Canada in the last 10 years,
Right.
in terms of our differences should be more salient so we could redress past injustices. So, I mean, Canadian citizens would know this from the Quebec Rock division. Like we had that inbuilt in our citizenship from the
Right.
Quebec rest of Canada
Yeah.
difference, which Quebec always needed to have a leg up. They get per capita more arts and culture funding. They get per capita more funding for the Radio Canada. There's all these different. You had to push your minority that didn't had a difficult time over the centuries. You kind of push it, help it a little bit,
Hmm.
and that was sort of a sort of affirmative action. But on the level of, and we decided, okay, we are bilingual. We have these two cultures, and this is what we are, and so we're going to make both sides equal. So that's already inbit but within these two, it was completely agnostic citizenship, right? It doesn't matter what. A little less in Quebec, of course, but we don't. It's
Yeah, yeah,
especially
yeah,
clear
yeah.
now. Their citizenship way more secular than ours. We're like, okay, cover yourself if you want. We don't. You can be the mayor and wear a burqa. Whereas in Quebec, questions would be raised. But and so of course the indigenous activism became hugely prominent in the last 10 years, and I've noticed when you have competition announcements, names of government departments, all of these things started saying Canadian and Indigenous. Like it wasn't a one thing anymore. And you can clearly see that everywhere. And that was normalized. And of course, the department was renamed Crown Indigenous Relations, and the nation to nation conversation started, the concept started. I think Prime Minister said it many times. We want to talk to an indigenous population nation to nation. So there was this weird separation, conceptual separation going on. And of course, then came the Black Lives Matter and white versus black. We imported that from the US because everybody wants to have US problems. And so we grafted all these, and suddenly we found ourselves with race discourse in Canadian Anglo citizenship. And that was new to me. Like I've started seeing job competition to specify ethnic preference. And I
Hmm.
mean, you come from a low income country that could be quote unquote white. You don't consider yourself particularly privileged, let me tell you. So when you see a job, when you see an academic job competition that specifies two or three ethnic groups, and you see you stand no chance, you say, okay, this is not entirely fair. And I always presume Canadian citizenship has some sort of a fairness inbuilt in it. So things like that. And then in culture, culture got completely crazy, arts and culture. And everything became about what ethnic group you belong to, whether you're allowed to fictionalize characters of the other ethnic group or not, what kind of storyline you give them. Television became like that. It was all about oppression, the oppressed versus so you simplified the narratives, right? And so that's what I was trying to write about. And I signed that book contract 2022, just before the pandemic. And I opened the book the other week for some reason. I never read back my old stuff, but I opened a book and it struck me as very pandemic marked. Did you find that? Is
Pandemic marked.
yeah.
It's interesting. I've been reading. I've been trying to kind of familiar myself with a bit of the Canadian landscape more, and it didn't necessarily strike me as COVID centric because I've been engaging with a lot of COVID people because I realized that
Okay.
that seems to be a wound in our culture too that is still festering very much so and needs to, I think, be addressed at some point. And so those people like are very direct about it. And so your book felt a little bit pulled back from that, just but in the context I guess I was reading it in, it was kind of hitting more the kind of the ideas you're talking about right now about just kind of anti-racism. I guess might be kind of one of the ideas that embodies what you're speaking of. Maybe the collection of ideas that allowed the left to abandon the notion of free speech. These seem to be too, like I'm a big fan of the colorblind society ideal. It's so yeah, those are the ideas, and I saw you speaking about those kind of ideas, and I know you openly identify as a lesbian as well, and I think you're probably in the company of like Katie Herzog and Julie Bindau and the pushing back against the new kind of gender ideology that has also come with this collection of ideas. And so yeah, those, so I saw you kind of talking more about those ideas than, let's say, talking about medical ethics and
Okay.
COVID-19 and yeah,
Okay.
so
So it
yeah,
was maybe just that one chapter that I opened, but yeah, everything was exacerbated. All of this was exacerbated by the pandemic, by the
yeah,
fact that we got atomized, we got even more lonely than we had. Like I wrote about 2019, I wrote about the loneliness in North American cities. This was before the pandemic. Like
yeah,
nobody
yeah,
wanted to leave the house for years. Nobody wanted to have colleagues that they can interact. We saw each other as these entities of germs. Like it was just very very weird, and it was deep. The distrust among the citizen went deep, and this is where I felt, wow, this was really really unprecedented. What's happening now? And as you say, whereas other countries are now publishing books re-examining what was decided, what was done, what courses of actions were taken, what was good, what wasn't good, we are not doing that.
yeah,
We're just kind of pushing that whole period. Oh well, it's gone.
yeah,
There
yeah.
was, I think, there was a very good book recently. I think Jesse Single's doing an interview with him about school closures in the U.S.
Okay, yeah, yeah,
That's a thing that should have been looked at in Canada.
yeah, yeah.
We shut down really hard in most of the provinces, and we had kids not going to school for about a year or two or something. That must have left some traces. That
Oh, I
must.
think it has. Yeah, I think people have started, gathering up that kind of data and looking at it, and just for future reference, we should be examining all this stuff,
Exactly.
and not
Exactly.
ignoring it by any means. Yeah, I feel like it's a big part of the mission of this podcast when we talk about this set of ideas. I'd like to talk to people from archaeology, science, philosophy, anybody who kind of has those contrarian views. But when it comes to what you're saying, that a lot of these bad ideas that you're feeling kind of really changed Canadian culture have come from the left, and I'm guessing, like me, you probably were someone who was comfortable identifying as a lefty or a liberal, at least for most of your life. And I'm still, I started going down this rabbit hole maybe 8, 9 years ago, and so I feel like in Canada in particular, we need to have that conversation. Like we're talking during a federal election where it looks like the federal NDP party they're on the verge of losing their official party status, and they're kind of the where we normally is the home of progressives in Canada, and so we kind of are, the left is just being obliterated right now, and at some point it needs to put itself back together again, uh, and to me, I feel like, yeah, that happens through conversations. We need to actually start discussing these bad ideas that we started widespread adopting on the left, and maybe taking it's not in a progressive mindset to take a step back, but maybe we just have to take one step back, like just not too far back. Both our lifetime, we were alive during this, like 5, 10 years. Like, just let's take a
Yeah.
step back and
Yeah.
reassess, and yeah, and so start discussing these ideas that we just brought in without discussion, and so yeah, that would be the goal here, is to, yeah, keep talking about these things.
Absolutely. And not do what the Democrats are doing, which is nothing. The Democrats are like deer in
Yeah,
headlights.
yeah.
Oops, something happened. We don't know. Let's just take a break. That is the worst course of action you can
Well, they're
take.
double downing on a lot of these stuff, and like getting, yeah,
Yeah.
it's like with the gender ideology, it's kind of like I'm in an uncomfortable position with this podcast where I call it bad Canadians, because, like, let's say with gender ideology, like if you believe, like I believe, that there's a phenomenon, of being trans. I do really think that that's something that occurs in people, and it's probably a really tough struggle to deal with in your
Yeah.
life.
Gender
Um,
dysphoria. Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
if you have that dysphoria, but I want to support those people, and I want them to not face discrimination, but I also want to be able to make up my own mind, and I don't have to say that if my father decides one day that he is a woman, that he is a woman now, full stop, end of story. And like, we need to have that conversation, about that,
Yeah.
because, but it's weird because I'm a contrarian. You speak like you're Amy Ham, and you talk about that, and all the Canadian institutions, from the media to your human rights courts to your bodies of like the midwifery and nursing association, they think that's a bad perspective, but you talk to 90% of Canadians and they're on board with it. It's just common sense. So there's this weird disconnect occurring between our cultural institutions and the people on the ground. It's,
Yeah.
yeah. And so how did that change come about? What is driving that? And how do we reverse that?
Yeah, that's $1 million question. Well, one theory is one theory is too many people have degrees and they have to have some work. So,
Right.
like you sometimes hear the term elite overproduction. So, there's a lot of middle class kids who have these degrees, and they have to, they have to find some work to do. They have to have a project. They have to have some zeal. Their boomer parents had political projects, so they have. So now we have people working in HR and having these kind of jobs in publishing and jobs in various. Not reconciliation is now a big business too, like huge business.
Yeah.
So it's all these, I don't know, subcultures, you would say, and it's an employment scheme. It's a very, very, very well funded employment scheme, and it somehow got itself embedded. But I don't know why academia was so easy to capture. For example, like if
Yeah.
you're a tenured professor, why? Like the number of times I said to myself in the last 5 to 10 years, "Oh, he can't speak freely. He teaches at university," and then I catch myself. Where else can you speak freely?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
if you're gainfully employed, you have a full time job in a daily
Yeah.
or in at the CBC. This is your job. Like this is the job. You're not being shot in staircase. It's not Putin's Russia, right? Nobody's going to shoot you in the head like Politskaya was shot because she wrote about corruption in Putin regime. It's not going to happen. So relax. Your job is just that, and you failed it.
Yeah.
Like these people in academia earn like hundreds of thousands of dollars,
Yeah.
and they're quiet. They're avoiding topics. They don't want to raise. This is fascinating to me, and for especially as somebody who comes from authoritarian society, tried both left and right wing authoritarianism, and you're not covering organized crime in Italy. You're not going to be shot. Just how is that not like what is going on? Like you would presume there would be more backbone in these institutions. Like the media. Where do you even start with the traditional media? What they've been avoiding is questions, how they've been framing certain questions, and why I don't have a good answer. I mean,
With the media.
human cowardice, does that explain it? You can't.
Well,
I don't even tell you
yeah,
that.
that's if there's like the silent majority theory. I guess maybe there's like kind of just I can understand why you keep your head down, like especially if I'm a working class person. But I can imagine if you're an academic, a professional, someone who's built, maybe made sacrifices for your whole life to get somewhere, and you know that this backing this one comment or backing this one speaker or making a public statement about is going to completely sidetrack your entire career, and I can understand that why people kind of stay quiet in those situations. But I also worry though that there's just this abandonment of logic and reason, and there's people are kind of more doing the surface level emotional thinking, and they actually kind of believe they're on the good side and the right side of history, and especially when you go up higher up these kind of cultural institutions to the expert class, and they've been educated their whole life to believe these things, and they look around at their peer group and everybody around them seems to believe these things, and it's quite common, I think, to find people who believe that to be a good moral person who wants to care about the future for as many people as possible, you have to be a progressive, and you can't be that person and be anything else. You can't be a conservative and think that way, and you can't. And so they just do this really easy math. And I know I was guilty of that, where like in my earlier years, if I saw someone criticizing feminism, well, I didn't have to engage with their argument to see if it was valid. It was just all I knew was they're criticizing feminism. That's all I need to know. Feminism is an unapologetic good. there, if only bad people criticize it. And so that was the kind of calculation I was doing in my head at the time, is we have these, what psychologists call schemas, I guess, that just help us get through our days really quickly. And so I feel that's the biggest challenge, is kind of getting through that barrier and just, convincing people that, yeah, no, your political opponents might actually be moral, stand up people. But yeah,
And the conversation should be happening. I mean, when you said feminism, nobody criticized feminists as much as other feminists. I mean, it's when you say feminism, it's constant civil war and has
yeah,
been until again about 10 years ago, when a certain hegemonic discourse took over. So it's interesting. It's all these different, also indigenous rights. Certain hegemonic party line took over, because there's been a lot of all kinds of opinions about how we redress the indigenous injustices and all that. The fact that indigenous people are still overrepresented in prison population,
yeah,
in overdose deaths population, and in suicides population. It's an important issue.
hmm,
No, it was one party line. This is what we're going to do. Anybody who says something else, racist and so on, right? Denialism and all that. So something happened everywhere in the last 10 years in one of the wealthiest countries in the world. But this happened across the Anglo world. So it has to do with the internet for sure.
right,
And
yeah,
it has to do with journalism bottoming out and the business model for journalism completely falling,
yeah,
and media just thinning to the bare minimum. But again, I don't know why in the academe. So it's I wish I knew the answer, so we can immunize ourselves for the next onslaught. I mean,
yeah,
look what's happening in the U.S.
yeah,
Now.
yeah,
The right has gone crazy.
yeah, yeah,
Now we have the double whammy, uh, the entrenched left wing progressive in institutions like university, and then the right wing is going from this to right. It's madness.
yeah, yeah. No, and it sounds like you've kind of had that experience of being on both sides of that political.
Yes,
Like, what was journalism? Did you left Montenegro and went to Belgrade to study journalism,
that's right. That's
and
right.
so
That
what
was the
was
biggest. Yeah, that was the biggest city, and a lot of people did that
and so what was
as an
studying
18.
journalism in Belgrade in the '90s like?
Great question. It was part of the political science. So you had, and it was much more serious than Western. I mean, it was much more difficult. We didn't have written tests. All the tests were oral, so you had to
Oh,
present.
well, we have to get
Like,
back
and
to
you
that with the chat GPT and stuff. That's kind of the model we have to return to.
that's where we're going. And you would have way, way, way more courses. Like I had something like 35, 36, 37 courses.
Wow.
So that would be like 8 a year or something. And then you very serious thesis, you're doing very serious thesis. But what was interesting is that was just as the pluralism was introduced, so you could read everything basically. Like only 10 years prior, you couldn't really read anything in poli sci and journalism
Right.
departments. You had to read, and there was no chance. But back then, when did I start? 92, 93. You could literally introduce anything into a class. There was no verbal delict. Verbal delict was a thing from communism that was gone by now, but by then. And you had all kinds of crazy ideas. I mean, you could name fascists in the class, you can name Stalinists in the class, you can name
Wow.
classical liberals, and you all talked. But we were
Wow.
all kids, like when you were 19, 20. You're testing ideas for a walk, right? It's suddenly, oh, this is interesting. Wow, ethno nationalism. Wow, that's very exciting. So it was really genuine pluralism. It's not easy. It wasn't easy. And political situation was very volatile. We had hyperinflation. It wasn't easy, but it was a much more interesting university experience for sure.
The concept of blood and soil kind of comes up in your book, and you kind of tie that to that indigenous rights movement. Kind of, could you speak to that like a bit about like the idea of blood and soil and your concerns kind of around adopting that kind of framework?
Yeah, well, that's the ethnic basis of nationalism, an ethnic basis of a community. And I think that's sort of normalized again as redress to anti-indigenous injustices, sort of normalized in Canada, but it wasn't so hegemonic as it is now. Like it's so important now. The settler indigenous division is huge, especially after 2021. We've experienced 2021. It's like there's no, and this notion of reconciliation that just doesn't have end goal. Like, when
Yeah.
are we sufficiently reconciled, and also how are we reconciling? And especially, that's totally gaslighting. When I tell this Canadian, they don't get it. It's total gaslighting to immigrants. Like, what is a Nigerian and Montenegrin and Colombian reconciling? When did we fall apart? When did we have a falling out with indigenous people?
Right. Yeah.
That is not a national program. And of course, it's people are tuning out. It's not a it's not a basis for solidarity.
It seems the
It's
opposite. It's
nothing. It's exactly, it's opposite.
yeah.
It's expiation process. And of course, now you have immigrants who get paperwork. You've probably heard of the Canadian Institute for Canadian Citizenship. They have these studies periodically to see whether we're maintaining citizens, what's happening with them, are they working in their area of expertise, what's happening. So one of their recent reports was about huge percentage of people who just get basic paperwork and then leave.
Oh,
They go to a different country with the US, da, 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 or go back. So that's increased in
right.
the
Right.
last 10, 20. I'm not sure how many.
Right.
So retention has gone down. So people just come here for password and just go.
And I guess we used to have a much internationally lauded immigration program, didn't we? For decades, it seemed like we had something that people really looked up to.
Well, this, I don't,
Ah, okay. This is yeah.
it's, depends where you put your pin on it. Like, when I went through the system, it was already backlogged to the point of total inefficiency.
Ah, okay.
And this is Chrétien liberals, Martin, last few years. It was such a neglected portfolio. Like, you had to wait 5 years since you submitted your permanent residence application to get it processed. And
Right.
then you had to drive across the border and so on. And that was one of the lowest points of our immigration system. And I think as when the conservatives came in, within a few years, they changed that. They fixed that. They alleviated some backlogs and stuff. Credit to them. And
Oh,
now several different programs are introduced. You don't have to wait 5 years for your. But that was scandalous. But of course, we're not citizens, so they don't care.
right,
If you,
right, yeah.
if you inconvenience non-citizens, no, and you get money off them, multiple fees and
Right, right.
but the idea, the point system, yes, it's been done. Australia has the point system too, and I think does US have any point system of similar? I'm not sure, but I think Brits experimented with it a little bit. I think we introduced it when we decided as a country we don't want to be solely French and British. We can
Right,
get anybody in, and here's the ethnic blind system. You just go through these points, and if you have this is what we want as a country, then you can come in. And
right,
this is where when East Asians and South Asians kind of was massive inroads.
right. Oh, right. And so you're thinking that the retention levels, are you suggesting that they're kind of lowering because immigrants are struggling harder to find that collective identity, that home,
That's
that
definitely,
this is my new home kind of, and so
yeah,
they're
yeah,
moving on to find somewhere else that they,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Okay.
Nobody's addressing this. We're all addressing, as we should, housing. It's a huge problem. Nobody can afford to live anywhere in big cities, and these are the economic engines of our societies, like the
Yeah.
4 or 5 cities. I know it's not a good idea, but that's what we have. But nobody can afford to live there. Uh, and also, of course, the disparity between getting hundreds of thousands of people and then not having jobs for them. So, of
Yeah.
course, this is the famous, excuse me, this is the famous cliche of a physician driving a cab and all that. That
Right.
that
Right.
that does happen. Very few people, especially if you're not coming from STEM discipline. If you're coming from STEM, you're good. Science, technology, engineering, maths, you're probably going to work in your field. If you're coming from anything else, like humanities, uh, NGO, consulting, HR, social sciences, you will have difficulty.
Right.
But we haven't looked at that. We just blindly have hundreds of, oh, you have an MA in politics? Sure, come on in.
Right.
So that's been a little bit. So that's another thing that is being addressed in the media. But this third thing that we're talking about, no. And I always raise this. You have to offer something to people. They can't just come here and this is a nothing country. And our culture can be anything.
Right.
And it doesn't, history doesn't matter. It's all bad. And we really are just expiating.
Right,
That
right.
is not a national. That is not a program for national belonging. That's not a citizenship.
What did you come to when you came here 99 2000? What did you experience? What was your it wasn't this. What was it?
It was sort of an idea of fairness and non-ethnic citizenship, because that's still very rare. Like my country has old country has ethnicized within a few years very fast, and suddenly that was the only thing that mattered: your ethnic and religious background.
Right.
And I mean, most countries are like that. You look at any country in the world. So this is a huge, huge, huge step, and that's always interesting. That's always appealing to somebody from highly ethnicized countries. Also, it's the appeal of the Anglo and Franco civilizations. Like you had those two components proudly as part of citizenship.
Right, right.
French and I mean, it's fascinating. Both civilizations are very fascinating. And I knew a little bit. I knew a little bit about. I had watched André Melasson's movies, which are Quebecois movies for kids. Somehow they managed to be shown in Yugoslavia.
Uh-huh.
I watched. I mentioned some of these. There's a Quebec TV series called Les Filles de Caleb, Caleb's Daughters, which was set in a very poor village in Quebec in the late 1800s. And it was following a story of a young teacher who's sent to this village, and she's teaching her students, and she's dating a student, and how they survive. It's basically rural Quebec, and it was so popular you wouldn't believe. And also North of 60, you remember that
Yeah,
show?
I didn't watch it, but I was well aware of it at the time. I'd probably like it if I watched it, I think.
I want to see it again. I was looking for it the other day. I couldn't find it anywhere. I think, does it Apple? Who own? I can't remember who streams it now. That was hugely popular. That was a way, for example, to put the indigenous issues into fiction. And it wasn't
Right,
straightforward and easy fiction. Oh, these are the good guys. These are the bad guys. There's the goofy guy. Everybody was flawed. But you can still clearly see effects of injustice.
right,
But
yeah,
everybody was flawed. There was no black and white. So
yeah,
that show was incredibly popular. I had watched documentaries about Margaret Atwood. She was probably the most famous Canadian
right,
in the 90s. If you're not following sports, I mean, if you're following sports, you probably have other people that you know. But that was it. That was basically it. And then when I came, I started exploring. So that was a lot to explore, and I
yeah.
still that was it was a still non-loathing period of Canadian culture where you can still rejoice in your explorations of the culture.
Right, right. Yeah. And then, so what was it, a slow realization for you, or was it an epiphany one moment, or did it, what, and I imagine the circles you embedded yourself in, you became very unpopular the more you started talking about these ideas, because those Canadian cultural circles, theater and all, I imagine they tend to be leaning more into these ideas than not. You're not going to the gun range and on the weekends with your friends. But so yeah, like how is this, even just reading your back of your book cover talking about the hardening of the settler indigenous, just, yeah, it still bristles to hear these words being spoken out loud sometimes, and it's like,
Yeah.
and so what was that process like for you? How did you even come to it? Yeah, how did that occur?
I don't know. I think as with everything, the pandemic sped it up. But I think I was already in 2017, 2018 noticing stuff. And I had a piece in the Little Review of Canada about free speech in February 2020, in which I said, well, listen, Megan Murphy has every right to rent a room in a public library.
Yeah,
That
right.
was a huge, huge, and I just listed a few things that have gotten really weird. And I wrote, well, guys, this is unusual. I haven't seen this. I haven't seen this in my however many years was I here. Um, so before that, let's say 17 maybe. I mean, some people use the word peaked, but it's something you start noticing. So maybe 16, 17, maybe 15. I know some people have started noticing 2012, and I don't think I did. Maybe I wasn't moving in those circles. But yes, significant change in culture 2017, 19, 18, 19.
Hmm.
And by early 2020, it was acute. And then, of
Yeah.
course, pandemic made it super acute.
Yeah. We had the summer of 2020 there. Yeah.
But you never know. And of course, like up to that point, I think I had specialized too much as a freelance journalist in writing about classical music and opera. And I thought, I'll just always have work because I know this field, I'll always have suddenly that completely disappear.
Yeah.
And basically, most of Canadian arts journalism disappeared. Art criticism was completely gone. And of course, pandemic just totally cleaned that up. And I finally suddenly, whoa, what's going on? So that happened, and then the ideology took over. I wonder if the two are connected. I wonder if the journalism bottoming. What's the expression? Bottom out. Is that
Yeah. Well, I know I left journalism when I found that the more and more there was just not competing voices found there. It felt
yeah,
like, and there was a conscious shift in journalism away from that neutral presentation of facts to an embracing of what they call activist journalism, where they do really believe that you're helping one side or the other. And so I think anybody who's actually like, reaching out to these tools to try to make sense of the world, they're just not doing a very good job anymore. And so the
yeah,
incentive isn't there to keep going there. The incentive is to go somewhere else to try to find that information. And that's
yeah.
that's
And
where,
I mean, the CBC became a catastrophe, like a
yeah.
dereliction of journalistic duty completely, and all somehow happened to get. But to complete my thought about your question, you never know if you're blacklisted. You just pitch, and most people don't reply. And if you start thinking, oh my God, I'm probably blacklisted for political reasons, therein lies madness. So, I mean, it probably happens. Like, I know there were opportunities that had my name on them. Like, I could have, in normal times, I could have easily gotten them.
Yeah.
Various residences and, the sinecures and panel. Like, for example, Toronto Public Library has tried a million times to offer my services as an interviewer. Like they have these, guests, you interview authors and stuff. Never once, never one. Various things that under normal conditions in peacetime, as I'm joking, in peacetime you would get these jobs immediately. All kinds of other jobs were just no total silence. But I mustn't overanalyze it in the political key, right?
Yeah.
Once you start doing that,
Yeah.
it's you're going down a spiral. So you got to stay agnostic and say, okay, the fact that this particular publication never, ever, ever responds to me now, and they would 2 years ago, it doesn't mean they don't like my politics. It doesn't mean they Googled me. The fact that for this job I didn't even get an interview, you just can't. You got to keep yourself sane. It's a sanity hygiene, right? You got to.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
You
Yeah.
always ascribe to incompetence, not to evil. So it's
Yeah.
got to be.
Yeah, and you're probably right most of the time. Yeah, yeah. And so, with we were seeing out the hollowing out of the legacy media, like we're speaking of, and the rise corresponding to that, to let's say citizen journalism and podcasts and all this. Is there anything happening in the Canadian cultural arts and culture scene that have you contemplated starting up a theater, opera, culture based podcast that kind of covers that information for the people that are now missing it because no one else is there, or is there just not the appetite anymore, or is that
That's
happening?
such a great question. I think when you stop doing it, you lose the audience too. And
Right.
if you keep doing it, it's a virtuous circle. So if you keep doing it, you're creating your audience, and then that audience creates more demand, and you create. Once you stop doing it and you offer nothing, the audience is going to be gone.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
it's like shutting down the entire performing arts for 2 or 3 years, and then you show up for 4 years later. Oh, we're back! Bring us your subscription money. No,
Right. Yeah. Do you find
those
it? Oh,
audiences have moved on, and so in readership wise, those audiences might probably moved on. But it's interesting. It's particularly hard. I'll tell you what exploded. You probably have noticed this, but not in Canada as much. Although we have some ripples. History,
oh,
history podcast.
yeah.
I mean, that's not only when going above the level that mainstream media covered is way, 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 way over what mainstream media covered some 10 years ago.
Yeah, I love
It's
the
just
like Dan Carlin's
extremely
hardcore
popular.
history. I've listened to like a 28-hour series on World War One. That was like one of the best things I've ever listened to. He has this ability to bring you back into
Yeah,
the context of the time, so you kind of
yeah,
understand it in the moment. And yeah, or even just with you when I encountered your book, it was YouTube I went to. I watched various documentaries on the Yugoslavian Civil War, the kind I had to start with like what is a Slav, like because I had
exactly.
just like yeah, but
Exactly.
all that yeah, there's like yeah, just so much. I follow podcasts about the early settlement of the Americas, like
Yeah,
and that's I find that a fascinating subject, and yeah, but it's all online.
yeah,
It's yeah, it's
yeah.
just fascinating.
And I mean, I'm sure you heard the rest is history. They have million
Yeah,
downloads every month.
yeah.
Brother of Tom Holland has a podcast with his buddy called "We Have Ways of Making You Talk" that only do World War II. So
Oh,
we're
really?
talking years and years of World War II, massive audiences.
Right.
Then,
Yeah,
of
yeah.
course, you get the guy Mike Davis. I forget what his name is. He does narrative podcasts. So he chooses. I don't think he's even an historian. He's just a
I'm not
guy
sure.
interested in history.
Yeah,
So he does narrative. So I prefer like conversational podcasts. But some people are mad about narrative podcasts. So they would just walk the dog or walk and wash the dishes and listen to a narrative. So
yeah.
French Revolution has a narrative and that kind of stuff. Yeah, that's extraordinary. And then Dan Snow in Britain has history. But he's Margaret Macmillan's nephew, right? You know that
No, I
connection.
don't. No, I didn't. I'm not familiar with them. So yeah.
So, so Margaret Macmillan is one of our most popular historians, and her sister is Anne Macmillan, who's married to a British retired journalist. His last name is Snow. I forget what his first name is. So their son has one of the most popular history podcasts
Ah. Oh.
online, and
Yeah.
he's kind of half Canadian. He did a good episode about the making of Canada with the rest of history. But history is doing great. There's no equivalent for literature, for example. I know maybe three book podcasts that are doing great.
Right. Right. Huh.
I know no theater podcasts that are doing great. I
Right.
mean, there are some about musicals that
Could that be
specialize
like
in musical.
demographics? Like I know in our locally here, our symphony has been putting on, I think to quite success. They've been putting on like they just had the Princess Bride, and they played the Princess Bride movie, and then the symphony plays the soundtrack along, and they put on 3 shows for this thing because
Yeah.
like it's just and I asked my coworker who went, and he said that there's a lot of younger people throughout the crowd, and so is there in these scenes, are they declining, or are there young people to fill the to come up behind the older generation? And could there be a demographics here where the traditional users or goers to theater aren't natural podcasters and stuff, and maybe as a younger generation comes up that's more comfortable with digital technology, that they might embrace those things
Let's
more?
hope. I hope that's the case rather than just audience dying out. I
Is
hope
the
this.
Are the audiences there, do you find? Are there or is it dying out when you go to these things? Are they
I
losing
mean,
the younger audiences?
if you look at Stratford Festival, Shaw Festival, Symphony here in Toronto, and every symphony in North America, um, opera, they have incredibly cheap tickets for the under 30.
Right.
Like you can for change, you literally can go for change.
Like
Bring a friend, their ticket's going to be changed like $10,
by demographic,
$20.
like you show an ID and you get a cheaper
Yeah,
ticket? Oh,
yeah, yeah.
really? Wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, everybody wants under 30s. So they've
yeah.
cheapened the tickets. They have special events for under 20s and third for under 30. 20 is now beyond. So under 30s. Some even under 40s, it's become the holy grail. So I don't know where the disconnect is. I know young people who do go, but it's not a massive renewal. So all of these programs are popular, but are they renewing audiences fully? I'm not sure. I guess maybe we'll find out in some decades.
Yeah. Yeah.
When you go to the symphony, of course, it's all gray heads, and this is people who've donated for many years to their symphony, and I
Yeah.
don't think their kids are donating or will be donating in the same way.
Yeah.
And also this difference in ethnic groups. I think huge growth in East Asian population in classical music.
Right. Yeah.
So there you would have. I don't want to bring you the cliche of the tiger mom. So, but that's most music school kids are basically East Asians now,
Yeah.
because that's now become hugely important for middle class East Asian families to have some musical education.
Right.
And there's more discipline. You could argue there's more discipline East Asian parenting. And so you have quite a few kids doing violin, doing piano. Um, and so those kids are inevitably future classical music audience. But the question is there going to be enough?
Yeah, yeah. I guess it's just a sign of the times a bit too. I often wonder what we're going through. I think there's many threads that always come together in history, that are pulling at the same time. And one of them that I think is this just technology, just like we create these elaborate systems, and as we get more connected globally, we create these huge robust systems, and then something like the internet comes along and just like turns everything upside down. And I wonder sometimes if we're just going through another one of those phases right now where we're kind of in this post World War II setup that's been going on for 75 years. But it doesn't really reflect the world that kids are being born into these days, where there's no paper, they're not writing, they're barely using cash, everything's digital, and we have this leadership that is kind of has just learned how to use their phones, but they're terrified of social media. They see it as a harm, and they don't get they're scared of the of digitalization, and they don't understand Bitcoin at all, don't know what that is, and so part of me wonders if it's just like you see AI coming up, and what's going on down south with AI and efficiency, and all this stuff. And part of me wonders just how much that technological crunch is happening right now, where a lot of these incentive structures of like loneliness, like, well, when I found out our Canadian athlete Ben Johnson won the gold medal at the Olympics, someone told me that. And like when he got stripped of his gold medal, someone told me that on the playground. And when I found a new Pink Floyd album, someone told you had to talk to people to get
Yeah.
information. It was the only
Yeah.
way you got. And now you can just go on even if you're in a school social clique group in middle school, you can find your information online. You don't have to talk to people. And so yeah, it just seems like there's all these incentives just pushing us into these more atomized niche little
Yeah.
areas, and
Yeah.
yeah, and so I don't know if we're going to have those days where we have big theaters full of like, people watching opera again, because there's just such a fighting for attention these days, it's
Well,
a,
it's funny. It's funny. Depends who it is. There's a few composers that will always fill fill the
yeah,
halls, always. And but everybody wants. Oh, but new music is more cool, and we want our own. And then you finally program a new opera, and nobody comes.
yeah,
So I mean, that's classical and opera have their own canon issue. But I want to pick up on something that you said about digital lives. Well, some people argue reading is over, like books and like we had the so-called Gutenberg parentheses, which
yeah,
is from what 1493, let's say, but it really took on 100 years later, and now it's kind of closing because now you see all these studies that kids are not reading.
no, yeah,
Even in Ivy League schools, you have people who have come to study literature. They have difficulty finishing a book.
right, yeah,
And talk to any professor in humanities, nobody reads a book anymore. They all have bits and stuff. So we are deliterizing our societies. Like we're becoming dumber as we contract out these brain functions and delegate these brain functions to AI searches and stuff.
yeah,
My only hope is then the internet is going to junkify so much. I mean, you already use Google search. It's now AI basically. So you give the AI junk
yeah,
first, and then you skip that, then you go to Google search. So my hope is that the internet is going to and AI is going to junkify everything so much that we're going to start abandoning it.
right, right.
But it can go either way. We can just become so dependent on this blob of junk and information, or we can just say no, enough. I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
Which way do you think we're going to go?
Well, I don't know. In some ways, I could see it maybe, I think the way these things tend to go is they don't go one way. We end up with these hybrids of things, and so I could see where behind the scenes already AI is taking over behind the scenes all the time, just doing little jobs here and there. But, maybe like we spoke about earlier, maybe a return to education, having to have oral exams and doing
Yeah.
things like a return back to that, which could bring back more rigorous study, have people become clearer, more independent thinkers again. So that could be an upside to that. But yeah, I think there is a concern to relying too much on the on those tools to.
Yeah, I wonder if we'll have like the new orality, like poetry. I come from the part of the world where epic poetry was huge for the longest time.
Right.
Like how you fight off the Turks, and it was big Orthodox Christian mythology tied to epic poetry, and you would have blind popular poets just doing their thing and just giving you the poem. So it's like some archaeologists argued that's how Homer, but that's
It started
Homer.
as an
Like it
oral
was
tradition.
probably a
Yeah.
group of blind people who it was
Oh,
oral and somebody took it down.
yeah.
So it doesn't have the original author. It just goes from one poet to the next poet. So it's all in the saying. So there was nothing written down. So this was pre-novel. So I don't know. Maybe poetry will return in some form, but I don't know.
Well, that's a good point because people do make the point that we've only been reading for, like you say, 400 or 500 years in mass, but we've been
Yeah,
listening for hundreds of thousands,
much
if not
longer.
as hominoids probably long, who knows how long. And so
Much
and I
longer.
think that's like this this listening revolution, passive list podcasts and the history podcast you're talking about. I think maybe we may be really hardwired for that kind of thing. It's more so than reading per se. For the average person, might be the case, but
But what's that going to do? What's that going to do to democracy and electoral system? Are we going to become prey to charismatic speakers? And we're going back now. We're
yeah,
going
yeah.
back.
Yeah. No, I agree.
Like the
Yeah,
charismatic
yeah.
warriors are gonna just say, okay, just follow me, and we're gonna be, you
I,
can imagine all kind of dystopia.
I have an Audible account because I have the opportunity to work and listen to books, but I much prefer if I can have a book in my hand. It's definitely a step down to have to listen to the book as opposed to even just we all remember, like I can remember years ago what side of a page some little thing is, and I'll flip back to it, and yeah, I just love that feeling of a book in my hand. But I'm just want to be present to your time schedule here, so I might just start wrapping up here. But maybe if you I wanted to let people know where they could find you or your writings, or if you have anything new you want to talk about, you could say that. And maybe if you could just, we'll say goodbye to everybody, but if I could just keep you on the line here, just at the end here for a moment, that'd be great.
So I have a Substack in which I try to cover what no Canadian media cover. Basically, they've given up on Canadian culture and Canadian history, and all. So I try to cover that a little bit, and I try dry voice. I try to write and think freely, and so far it's extra institutional. So it's not. I mean, my newsletter is not yet self-sustaining. I have under 1,000 subscribers, which is not enough, but we're moving slowly up and
Right.
up. So I do that, and people can find me in the hub where I write about Canadian nonfiction at least once a month. So I read recent nonfiction. There's lots of history books that I write about. Occasionally write about music for the whole note, and we're talking, of course, classical music. I have my tastes in music are quite conservative. And what else? What else? I'm not sure. I think it's a great thing you're starting, and I can't wait to see where it goes.
Oh, well, thank you very much. Yeah. Well, once again, I'll say we're very grateful that you agreed to come on the show, and it was really nice talking with you. So thank you very
Thank you.
much,
Next
Lydia.
time we have to discuss your list of Canadiana,
Oh, if we can
which
get into
we
it.
haven't
Yeah.
even touched.
Yeah, we can go with that. All right. Well, thank you
Jesus
very
of
much.
Montreal is on it. That's I have to.
Oh yeah, that made an impact on me back when I watched that. Yeah, it was an interesting exercise. Like for a couple of days, things were just popping into my head. Back into my consciousness of
It
I remember
wasn't.
that. Yeah,
It wasn't really easy, right? It wasn't like bam, 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 bam. You had to sit down and think about it.
yeah. No, that was a good exercise.
That
Okay.
was great. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Bad Canadians, Working Class Roots, A Free Speech Lens, and Canadian Contrarians.